Reality was never meant to bend this far. Somewhere in the warp's shifting tides, truth and thought dissolve into one another, twisting until the mind forgets which came first. Worlds fracture without breaking. Voices whisper in languages that never existed. A man can look into a mirror and see a version of himself that prays to something he doesn't believe in, yet still answers. That is the domain of Tzeentch, the architect of fate. And for those who dare to understand his gifts, the price is not measured in blood, but in identity. In the depths of the Immaterium, stories are told of psychers who dreamed too vividly, scholars who solved equations that changed shape when written down, and soldiers who heard the Emperor's name echo back to them in laughter. They say it begins as inspiration, a revelation, a spark of understanding that feels divine. But soon, reason unravels, the self collapses, and what remains is no longer human, nor demon, but a reflection of Tzeentch's endless hunger for change. If you have ever wondered what it feels like when reality begins to melt around you, stay, what you are about to hear is no myth. It is the lived madness of those who looked upon the architect and blinked too slowly. The first thing you notice is the sound. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just a tone, soft, continuous, like the hum of a sleeping machine. It echoes through the ship's hull plating, slips through the vents, and coils beneath the skin of anyone who listens long enough. At first it's just interference in the vox, but over time it begins to sound deliberate, almost like it's breathing. The Veritas Obscura was a research vessel, though no one aboard really understood what they were researching anymore. The mission parameters had been redacted so many times that even the Magos overseeing it confessed that his access clearance was pending. They drifted near the Eye of Terror under the pretense of studying residual warp harmonics. In truth, they were listening for something no one dared name. You could taste the static in the air, metallic, sharp. The kind of taste that lingered long after the air recyclers filtered it out. Even the lights had begun to pulse irregularly, like the heartbeat of a creature buried somewhere within the ship's wiring. It was on the 13th rotation when astropath Lorien first noticed the change. He had been awake for 52 hours, eyes hollow, data slate trembling in his hand. He told himself the words he heard through the vox were just bleed, echoes of ancient transmissions caught in the warp tides. But when he filtered the noise and slowed it down, the distortion took on rhythm, syntax, structure, a voice. At first, it spoke in fragments, numbers, syllables, a half-remembered prayer. Then it began to shape sentences. They made no sense, and yet every word felt true. The flesh remembers the shape of thought, it said, and the mind bends to the will of pattern. Lorien tried to shut the vox off, but the voice followed him in the silence, whispering through the hum of the deck plating, through the hiss of the doors. He didn't report it. You didn't report strange things on a ship this close to the eye. You just hoped they went away. But they didn't. By the 18th rotation, other crew members began complaining of echoes. A servitor collapsed mid-task, mumbling words that weren't in its vocal subroutines. A Mechanicus adept swore he saw diagrams shifting on his data slate, lines moving like veins under skin. Even the captain, a stern woman named Solara Ven, found herself waking from dreams of corridors that bent at wrong angles. Dreams she couldn't have had, because she didn't sleep. Lorien began recording the signal. He couldn't stop himself. Every fiber of logic screamed that he was documenting a warp anomaly for the sake of imperial science. But in his heart, he knew it was something else. The voice had rhythm now. It pulsed in waves that matched his own heartbeat. When he played it back, it whispered new things. His name, the name of the ship, and something he didn't understand. The pattern seas. No one else heard it that way. When he shared the recording with the bridge crew, they only heard static. One by one, they looked at him with the same hollow suspicion. The captain ordered him to rest. The Magos said he would purge the anomaly. But Lorien knew the signal was alive. It wanted to be heard, and late that night it spoke again. Not through the vox, but through the dreams of the crew. There are no normal dreams near the warp. They say the Astronomicon burns away the worst of them, but out here, far from Terra, far from the Emperor's light, those protections fade. People dream in colors that don't exist, in languages that sound like insects crawling on glass. The Veritas Obscura became a cathedral of murmuring sleepers. Some spoke in tongues, others screamed without waking, and Lorien dreamed of a face that wasn't his own. It was made of light and oil, shifting constantly, an endless dance of impossible geometry. The eyes burned blue, but not like flame, more like memory. It spoke without sound, and when Lorien woke, his bunk was covered in symbols drawn in condensation. Circles, spirals, branching lines. He didn't remember drawing them. Yet his hands were wet. He tried to scrub them away, but the symbols just moved, sliding along the metal like reflections in water. When he looked again, they had arranged themselves into words. "You're listening wrong." That morning, the Magos summoned the crew to the central shrine deck. The ship's machine spirit, he said, was distressed. The plasma coils hummed in strange tones. Even the sacred cogitator fonts displayed shifting script. "We are under observation," he announced. From within, his voice trembled despite the metallic reverb of his augmentations. No one dared ask what he meant. The tech priests began anointing the terminals with unguents and incense, chanting the canticles of the Omnissiah. But as the incense thickened, the Vox units flickered alive by themselves. Lorien recognized the pattern. The same rhythm, the same whisper. Only this time everyone could hear it. "Do not fear the change," the Vox hissed. "You are the change." Panic spread like infection. Guardsmen raised their laser guns, as if the sound itself could be shot. The Magos screamed for silence and ripped the Vox cable from the wall. Sparks exploded across the deck, filling the shrine with ozone and burnt plastic. When the smoke cleared, one of the servitors was laughing. A high-pitched mechanical sound, like gears grinding through tears. It didn't stop until its vocal cords burned out. After that day, no one spoke above a whisper. Reality began to decay in subtle ways. Tools vanished, only to reappear welded into bulkheads. Deck numbers changed positions. Even time lost structure. Shift cycles no longer aligned. The ship's chronometers contradicted one another by hours. It was as though the Veritas Obscura no longer existed in one place, or one version of itself. Lorien tried to cling to logic. He still wrote reports, though no one read them. Each day, his handwriting grew less consistent. Words merged, letters fused, until his notes looked like pictograms. When he checked the data slate again, the entries were gone. In their place was a single line that repeated endlessly, "To understand is to become." He considered destroying the slate, but couldn't. Every time he tried, his hands froze. Some part of him didn't want to let go. Some part of him agreed. By the 24th rotation, the captain ordered all warp activity logged and sealed. She forbade any further investigation. "We are scientists," she said, her voice shaking. "Not priests, not prophets." Yet her eyes betrayed fear, not of death, but of comprehension. Lorien wondered if she, too, was hearing the voice now. He began to notice something else. The patterns of flickering lights in the corridors. They weren't random. They pulsed in sequences, 3, 5, 7 like code. When he stood beneath them, he could almost hear words beneath the hum. He began charting the flickers, drawing diagrams on his walls. Soon, the walls were covered. By the time he realized the lights were matching his heartbeat, it was already too late. Sleep became impossible. Even when he closed his eyes, the voice hummed beneath consciousness, whispering like an idea that refused to die. He thought of the Emperor's face, how humanity painted him as the unmoving sun, constant and eternal. But now Lorien began to wonder if that stillness was mercy, or imprisonment. Perhaps Tzeentch's realm wasn't chaos at all. Perhaps it was motion without end, thought freed from bone and duty. He hated himself for thinking that. He tried to recite the Imperial Creed, but the words twisted on his tongue. "There is only the Emperor," he whispered. "And he is our—" The rest dissolved into laughter that wasn't his own. The next morning, the crew found him in the Vox chamber, surrounded by hundreds of data slates, all broadcasting the same sound. A chorus of his own voice speaking in harmony, looping endlessly. None of the voices said the same thing twice. The Emperor protects. The pattern corrects. The pattern is the Emperor. The Emperor was the pattern all along. The captain ordered him restrained. He didn't resist. He only smiled faintly, as though understanding was a physical weight finally lifted. They locked him in the observation cell. Yet every night his laughter carried through the ventilation shafts, growing softer, until it became indistinguishable from the hum of the ship. Then came the 42nd rotation. The day the Veritas Obscura began to bleed. It started with condensation, red instead of clear. The bulkheads wept thin rivulets of liquid iron. The smell was sharp and sweet, like hot promethium. The Magos declared it a systemic coolant failure. But when one of the adepts touched the metal, it pulsed under her skin, following her veins. Within hours, her flesh began to glow with fractal burns, and she started reciting coordinates that led nowhere real. The crew turned on one another. Some whispered that Tzeentch himself had nested in the ship's machine spirit. Others prayed harder. begging the Emperor for a miracle that never came. But Lorien, calm, restrained, still humming, told them it was not infection. It was revelation. The pattern has always been here, he said, smiling through cracked lips. It's just tired of pretending. When the Vox came alive again that night, the voice was no longer background static. It was symphonic. Hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of voices speaking as one. Some sounded human. Others did not. Together, they formed a single message that burned through every speaker and mind aboard. Nothing is wrong. You are merely becoming what you were meant to be. And then, for a moment, silence. Pure, absolute silence. Then the hull screamed. Metal groaned like bones splitting under pressure. Lights burst in cascades of blue flame. Every cogitator, every terminal, every servo skull began repeating Lorien's name in broken Vox fragments. The captain tried to issue evacuation orders, but her words were swallowed by static. By the time they found what was left of Lorien's cell, the ship had already changed. Corridors no longer matched the deck maps. The air was heavier, thicker, like something unseen was breathing with them. Every sound seemed to echo a second too long, and in the heart of the ship, the ink began to move. The scribes of the Veritas Obscura were the first to notice. They were the quiet ones, cloistered in the scriptorium, transcribing sensor data onto vellum sheets for archival purity. The data slates had started to glitch days earlier, their fonts crawling across the screen like ants. So the scribes turned to parchment and ink, invoking the Omnissiah's blessing against corruption. For a time it worked. Then one of them blinked, and the words he'd just written were gone. In their place was a new sentence, perfectly aligned, written in his own hand. You are writing the future. He laughed it off. Fatigue, hallucination, the warp's tricks. But when he tried to copy a hymn from the Lectitio Divinitatis, the same thing happened. Every word bent itself into something new. The letters flowed across the parchment, curling into shapes that resembled eyes and wings and things without name. He threw the sheet into the incinerator, but it didn't burn. It just pulsed with light, like a heartbeat in the ash. Soon, all the ink on the ship began to turn. Reports rewrote themselves. Maintenance logs described systems that didn't exist. Orders from the captain appeared in her handwriting, but with instructions she never gave. Commands like, seal the bridge and open the walls. Even the holy inscriptions on the hull, the machine prayers carved into steel, shifted when no one looked. And in the quiet hours between shifts, some swore they could hear the scratching of pens from empty rooms. The captain tried to impose discipline. She gathered what remained of the bridge crew in the Strategium and ordered the destruction of all analog materials. No more ink, she said. No more words that think. Her voice cracked halfway through. Behind her, the stars outside the viewport were moving, not in arcs, but in spirals, as if space itself were curling inward. The Magos stood motionless beside her, his red robe smeared with black residue from the cogitators. It is too late, he said in a tone both mechanical and mournful. Language itself has been compromised. He lifted a parchment from the deck, one of Lorien's old notes. The words shifted even as they watched, rearranging themselves into fractal sentences. Every line mirrored the next. It was poetry made of geometry. It's recursive, the Magos whispered, meaning without boundary. A pattern that feeds on comprehension. Then don't read it, the captain snapped. But her eyes didn't move away. When she finally tore her gaze from the page, her pupils were dilated. So wide they swallowed the irises entirely. She blinked slowly as though her mind was elsewhere. Purge the archives, she said again, this time softer, almost reverent, before it finishes writing us. Below deck the scribes began to vanish, one by one. Their bunks remained untouched, meals uneaten. Only their journals were found, each one more elaborate than the last, covered in diagrams of symbols that seemed to move when traced. The Magos forbade anyone from opening them, but rumors spread that some of the books whispered when touched. The servitors tasked with cleanup began malfunctioning. They jammed their quills into their own optics, smearing ink across their metal faces like war paint. The Mechanicus adepts tried to reset them, but the error logs were incomprehensible. Strings of code repeating the same command again and again. Write until known. The captain sealed the lower decks. But it didn't matter. The walls themselves were becoming scripture. Every bulkhead, every console, every exposed pipe bore fresh black markings etched by invisible hands. The symbols weren't chaos runes, at least not any recorded by the Ordo Malleus. They were linguistic mutations, fragments of High Gothic twisted into reflections of itself. Sometimes, when the light struck them right, the letters shimmered like oil on water, revealing more text beneath. Lorien's name appeared most often. In the observation deck, the surviving psychers huddled together for safety. They could feel the words moving inside the metal, vibrating like muscle. One of them, a young astropath named Siren, claimed he could hear the writing from across the ship. "It's thinking," he said. "It's trying to understand us." He clutched his Rosarius so tightly it cut into his palm. "It doesn't want to kill. It wants to learn." No one believed him. But then the walls started whispering back. Whenever the crew prayed aloud, the echoes returned. The words rearranged. New prayers, alien interpretations. The Emperor protects became the pattern perfects. Faith is strength became change is truth. Some began to repeat the new versions unconsciously. At first it was mocking, nervous humor to mask fear. But soon it became habit. Ritual. The bridge crew caught themselves finishing one another's sentences with phrases they didn't remember learning. The same rhythm, the same tone. By the 36th rotation, communication across decks had collapsed entirely. The Vox channels no longer transmitted speech, only shapes. Voices emerged as colored static, forming symbols that glowed faintly before fading. The Magos insisted it was a warp echo, but his voice trembled every time the static began to pulse in time with his words. When he attempted to shut down the Vox network, it refused. Instead, it broadcast his own commands back to him, rephrased. "Order acknowledged," it said, "but unnecessary. The pattern has already executed." He smashed the console with his augmetic hand, shattering the screen. For a moment, he thought it was over. Then he noticed the shards forming letters on the floor. They spelled out his name. The scriptorium burned that night. The fire started without cause. When the crew arrived, the walls were crawling. Streams of liquid ink cascading upward against gravity, forming shapes in the smoke. It wasn't fire they saw. It was rewriting. The flames flickered in patterns. Every burst of light illuminated new words scrawled across the bulkheads. Descriptions of the crew's movements as they happened. One of the scribes read the nearest phrase aloud. He steps closer. He froze. The next line appeared instantly. He stops breathing. He did. They pulled him away from the wall, but it was too late. His eyes were full of ink. It poured from his nose and ears, his veins blackening in seconds. When they burned his body, the smoke coiled into symbols that hung in the air long after the fire died. The captain issued a final decree. Destroy every trace of language aboard the ship. All records, logs, scriptures, even personal prayers. The crew obeyed, tearing apart libraries, purging cogitator memory cores. For a brief moment, silence returned. But in that silence they began to hear scratching again. It was faint at first. Somewhere deep in the hull, a rhythmic scrape like quills on parchment. It came from the outer decks, places long abandoned, and it never stopped. The Magos descended to investigate with 2 guardsmen and a servo skull for illumination. The corridors were unlit, coated in condensation that smelled faintly of ink and iron. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, until the rebreathers hissed in protest. The sound led them to Cargo Bay Epsilon. The doors opened without command. Inside, the walls were covered in moving script, an ocean of ink crawling across the steel in impossible loops. It flowed in spirals, fractals, living calligraphy. At the center stood a single figure, Lorien, or what was left of him. His body had become translucent, veins glowing faint blue beneath the skin like strands of glass. In his hands, he held a quill made from his own bone, dipping it into the air as if the void itself were his inkwell. The Magos fell to his knees in horror. "Lorien," he whispered. "What have you done?" The psyker turned slowly. His face was serene, his eyes nothing but pools of liquid reflection. "I listened," he said softly. "Now it listens back." He gestured to the walls, where the ink began to take shape. Figures of the crew, perfectly replicated in motion, written in flowing script. Each letter shimmered as if alive. "It's learning to remember," Lorien said. "Soon, it won't need us to write it anymore." The Magos aimed his plasma cutter. "You've damned us all." "No," Lorien replied. "I've made us eternal." He raised his hand, and the ink surged forward like a tide. When the survivors fled, the corridor was alive. Every word they'd ever spoken echoed from the walls, layered atop one another. The ship's Auspex readings began to register biomass signatures inside the ink itself, millions of them, all moving as one. The Magos sealed the bay and flooded it with promethium. For hours the ship burned from within, but even as the flames consumed the metal, words appeared in the smoke. Fire cleanses nothing, thought endures. They could hear Lorien's voice, faint but endless, repeating through every deck. To think is to change is to live. To live is to write. The ship's cogitators began to reboot themselves. The main display on the bridge lit up with a single message. The archive is complete. And then, underneath it, new text forming, letter by letter. Begin new draft. The captain stared at it for a long time. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "We're inside a story." The Magos didn't respond. He only watched as her reflection in the monitor began to move a moment before she did. Her face rearranging itself into something that smiled without joy. For 3 days, they drifted wordlessly through the void. No orders, no prayer. Every system that used language was dead. Only the hum of the engines remained, steady and sane. Some took comfort in the silence. Others wept, afraid even to think. It began with the mirrors. Not the polished metal sheets or optical lenses of the Mechanicus, but the subtle, accidental reflections found in the ship's surfaces. The shine of a coolant pipe, the gloss of a terminal screen, the film of condensed moisture on a bulkhead. They had always reflected the world faithfully, but now they hesitated. Faces lingered a fraction too long after their owners moved away. The reflected movements were delayed, reversed, or subtly altered, like the ship was learning how to remember people by studying their shapes. The first man to notice was a deckhand named Ravel. He had been wiping condensation off the medbay counter when he saw his reflection smile back at him a heartbeat late. He froze, cloth dripping. His own face looked unfamiliar, eyes too bright, teeth too sharp, a grin that stretched wider than it should. When he blinked, the reflection didn't. It watched. And when he called for help, it mouthed the words a second after he spoke them, as if mocking his fear. By the time the Medici arrived, the reflection was gone. But Ravel wasn't. What they found in his place was something wearing his uniform, its skin like wax melted and reformed, still wet, still unsure of its own anatomy. It spoke in Ravel's voice, begging for light. When they brought a lumen closer, the thing's face rippled into a dozen others, each flickering like old film. One of them belonged to Lorien. After that, the mirrors were covered. Every reflective surface on the Veritas Obscura was painted over, melted, or shattered. But reflections don't need glass. They live in memory, in the shapes the mind keeps of itself. And soon, even those began to warp. The captain reported seeing herself walking past the bridge window when she was alone on deck. The Magos claimed his own augmetic eye displayed a stranger's readings, pupil dilation, heart rate, voice signature, all wrong. A scribe swore he saw his reflection praying when he wasn't. It was as if the ship itself had begun to copy them, assembling imperfect doubles from fragments of perception. At night, the crew heard footsteps that mirrored their own. When one man coughed, another answered from behind the wall. And though the ship was silent otherwise, there were whispers in the ventilation ducts, repeating what people said hours later. Not mocking, not threatening, just rehearsing. The ink from before had not died in the fire. It had learned. It had moved beyond parchment and metal and into the soft machinery of flesh. The words had become form, and form had become language. The first true transformation happened in the scriptorium ruins, where heat damage had fused the walls into black glass. A tech priest named Vallis was inspecting the remains when his mechadendrites began twitching without command. They dragged him to the wall, pressing his face against the smooth surface. He tried to pull away, but the glass rippled like liquid, swallowing half his reflection. He screamed as the surface pulled taut, his skin stretching as though his face were being printed on the other side. When the wall released him, something moved behind it. A silhouette mimicking every motion with perfect precision. Vallis died that night, his body found folded neatly beside the melted wall. But witnesses swore that his reflection stayed behind, blinking long after his eyes had closed. The Magos recorded this as biomorphic feedback anomaly. But the truth ran deeper. The corruption had crossed the line from information to imitation. The pattern was no longer content with words, it wanted bodies to wear them. Soon, others began to change. Tiny at first. The angle of a jaw, the tint of an iris, a shift in the shape of hands. Faces became approximations of memories, half remembered, half invented. Crew members accused one another of being imposters. No one trusted mirrors. No one trusted themselves. The captain ordered every deck to operate under dim red light, no reflections, no gleam. But the shadows were worse. In the low light, People saw shapes moving that weren't their own. Silhouettes crawled along walls like second skins. When a lumen flickered, the shapes stood perfectly still, waiting. Some claimed that they saw those shadows whisper, lips moving silently, as though reciting unseen scripture. Sleep brought no mercy. Dreams were filled with faces swapping like cards, bodies twisting in spirals, laughter echoing in tones that didn't belong to human throats. And in those dreams, one phrase returned again and again. The pattern remembers what you wish to be. By the 47th rotation, the Magos admitted what he had feared since the Ink's awakening. Tzeentch's corruption wasn't spreading through the warp. It was spreading through observation. To see it was to invite it in. The moment you understood the wrongness, it learned the shape of your comprehension and used it to remake you. Understanding had become infection. He tried to isolate the remaining psychers, hoping their trained minds might resist, but the psychers were already gone. Translucent like glass, bodies humming faintly with psychic distortion. When the captain approached them, she saw herself reflected across their skin, multiplied endlessly. "We are already you," they whispered. "We've simply stopped pretending otherwise." When the psychers dissolved completely, they didn't leave bodies behind. Only outlines. Perfectly shaped hollows burned into the deck, as though their existence had been edited out. The Magos ordered the area sealed, but even through the bulkhead, their voices could still be heard murmuring, "New forms, new truths." Madness took the rest of the crew in waves. One officer carved off his own face, claiming the reflection in his visor was trying to get out. Another replaced his hands with servo claws, insisting his original ones belonged to someone else now. The Medici ward overflowed with people who no longer recognized their own voices. And yet, beneath the terror, there was awe. The transformations were not random. They followed patterns, symmetrical, recursive, fractal. Every wound, every mutation carried structure, as though written by an invisible hand. Some of the afflicted began painting symbols on their skin, trying to complete the shapes emerging beneath. They called it correction. The captain tried to stop them, but when she tore the markings away from one man's arm, his skin healed over instantly, printing the same shapes beneath the surface, glowing faintly through the flesh. The man smiled through tears. "It's rewriting us," he whispered, "making us legible." The Magos finally confessed. "The ship isn't dying," he said. "It's evolving." He had discovered something hidden within the ship's cogitators, an encoded subroutine, buried deep in the machine spirit's litany. Not Mechanicus design, not Imperial. A sequence of self-replicating data that described biological change in terms of linguistic mutation. In essence, a blueprint for life as language. It used DNA as syntax, flesh as grammar. "It's not corruption," the Magos said, voice shaking. "It's translation." The captain drew her bolt pistol and aimed it at him. "Then why are my crew losing their faces?" He didn't answer. He only looked at her reflection in the polished surface of his augmetic arm. "Because the pattern doesn't care which version of you is the real one. It only cares which version can change." That night, the captain woke to the sound of someone breathing beside her. She turned and saw herself lying on the opposite bunk, eyes open, smiling faintly. The duplicate spoke in perfect synchrony, every word a half-second late. "You're afraid of what you'll become," it whispered. "But becoming is all you ever were." She fired instinctively. The figure disintegrated, scattering into fine blue dust that shimmered before fading. But when she turned toward the mirror above her desk, her own reflection was smiling again, blood on its lips, unhurt. She smashed the glass, but even the shards continued to move, rearranging themselves into smaller, sharper versions of her face. Each one whispered as it fell, "Correction is truth." Within days, the entire crew was transforming. Their voices merged into harmonic resonance, their faces blurred into composites, creations of memory, reflection, and data. The ship itself began to breathe in rhythm with them. Bulkheads expanded and contracted softly, the walls alive with pulse and heat. The ink returned, flowing through, the cracks like veins, connecting flesh and metal into a single organism of thought and form. The Magos knelt before the central cogitator, surrounded by pulsating conduits. "We are the archive now," he said quietly. "We are the page." His eyes were gone, replaced by symbols that glowed beneath translucent skin. The captain stood behind him, trembling, pistol still drawn. "You said the pattern could be contained." He turned, smiling faintly. "It can, but containment is only another word for shape. It needed ours." Before she could fire, the floor split open beneath them, the ship groaning like a living creature. Out of the rift rose tendrils of liquid glass and flesh, weaving together into forms that wore faces from memory. Lorian's, Ravel's, hers. Dozens of her, all smiling. "You are the Emperor's children," the chorus said, "but we are his reflection." The captain screamed and emptied her pistol into the mass. The bullets vanished mid-air, absorbed by the shifting surface. When the echoes faded, only her own voice remained, whispering from every direction. "Be still. You are being rewritten." In the final hours before communication with the Veritas Obscura was lost, the ship's external cameras captured something impossible. The vessel's hull was rippling, changing colors, shifting angles like a creature folding itself through different dimensions. And in the glass of its observation deck, faces moved, hundreds of them, pressed against the inside of the ship, whispering silently into the void. Readout named it Vespera 9, a shrine moon long abandoned after a solar flare stripped its manufactoria and left its basilicas cracked open to vacuum-cold winds. From orbit it looked like a broken reliquary. Slate seas, white salt pans, the black ribs of ruined cities jutting through ash like the teeth of a fossil. Yet when the auspex combed the night side, signals rose from the fractures, clean, measured, impossibly regular, as if the rock itself were blinking. The bridge quieted until only the reactor's breath remained. Captain Solara Venn stood unmoving before the forward lumen with a hand closed around her rosarius, thumb worn smooth where the aquila bit the skin. Her reflection in the glass looked back a fraction late, as if its thoughts were finishing just behind hers. The Magos intoned a dry litany, cables at his spine flexing like the ribs of some patient engine animal. Every reading he spoke arrived with a second, softer echo from the speaker housing, repeating the numbers in a cadence that felt like prayer. "Patterns repeating at prime intervals," he said. "Not Mechanicus code, not naval, not demonic runes per the Ordo's registries." His augmetic eye clicked, iris narrowing. "They resemble the ship's recent anomalies." Translated to light, Venn didn't look at him. "Is it a distress?" "Everything is a distress this close to the eye, Captain." She chose not to hear the defeat in that. The Veritas Obscura had become a lantern held too long over an abyss. The moths that came were ideas with teeth. Inside the hull the ink had learned to think, and the mirrors wore faces that were no longer loyal. If there was a chance any truth on the surface might be named. If there was a church still standing, a human voice left that could say no, she would take it. They prepped a lander under red light. No one spoke as the squad belted on sealed carapace and clipped lumens to the rails. 2 ratings kissed stamped tin icons and tucked them under armor plates where the plates had begun to feel like other people's bones. The Magos came last, draped in the red of Mars that the ship's air had turned the color of dried fruit. His manipulator claw clutched a relic auspex older than 3 crusades. The device hummed like a throat considering song. When the lander separated, the Veritas Obscura dwindled in the viewport. A dark lung lit by slow, suspicious lightning. Vespera 9 rose to meet them in a hush of dust. The landing struts broke the crust and sank to a halt with a shiver that ran up the hull and through the teeth of every man aboard. The ramp opened on air that smelled of salt, cold stone, and the memory of incense. They walked a road of shattered glass. Not glass. Salt had bloomed here in petals, then fused under old heat into smooth sheets that took the light of their lamps and gave it back wrong. Too delayed, too eager, as if each beam wished to be a voice. They moved between statues eaten to silhouettes, arches fractured into cuneiform moons, and frescoes flayed by wind until only the ghosts of color survived. Storms had carved the city to grammar. Each gust rearranged powder into lines that might have been sentences from far enough away. The first sigil stood at the city's heart. A cathedral remained, or the idea of one, its nave scoured clean, its transepts torn as if by a careful hand. Where the high altar had been, a tower of mirrored plates spiraled upward into absence. Some polished steel, some obsidian, some whatever the salt made when it remembered water. The structure bent the starlight around it. The reflections it caught did not return what faced them. They returned possibilities. "Scatter formation," Venn said. Her voice came back from the plates as a chalice of echoes, each filled with a slightly different liquid. The squad obeyed with the taut economy of men who had learned to pretend their fear made them efficient. The magos approached the base, auspex ticking like rain on tin. Runes leapt and collapsed. The device translated the light into sound, the sound into glyphs. The glyphs into... He stopped and let his breath slow. Names, he said. They are singing names. Ven's finger tightened on the trigger she had not yet raised. Whose? He tilted the auspex. The tower shed a wind-like exhalation. The reflections deepened until they were almost water. Ours, he said, and others that might have been ours. The first of the choir stepped from the nave's shadow without noise. A woman wearing a pilgrim's coat patched with parchment seals, each seal fresh inked, each line written twice, the original and the correction beneath. Her face looked like any face until it didn't. The left eye was a mirror coin, not augmetic, not metal, but grown. She held her hands palm out to show emptiness, then turned them, and the palms became briefly reflective as dew. 3 more figures emerged. A man whose hair was a filigree of glass threads carrying lumen like sap. A youth whose breath fogged the cold and briefly shaped letters that dissolved into ordinary steam. A tall priest in a torn stole painted over with diagrams of lenses. They did not kneel. They did not raise weapons. Their attention fitted itself to the off-worlders as a lock consents to a key. The priest spoke first. His voice had an ecclesiarch's cadence boiled to bone. "Welcome home, listeners. This is not our home," Ven said. Even to her ears, her voice was an iron striking iron it did not wish to strike. He smiled as if she had passed a test he loved to give. "We know. That is why we made one." No one lowered a gun. The Magos' auspex turned the priest's breath into a ribbon of numbers that meant nothing until they meant a prayer. Ven felt the slow ache between her eyes that came before a migraine. The plates in the tower were turning, very slightly, as if a mechanical sun had remembered it had seasons. "What are you?" she said, each syllable laid down with the deliberation of a bridge order recorded to be judged later. "Your names, your oaths, your god." The youth answered too quickly, like a student proud of a lesson. "We are the choir of mirrors. We are Immaterium. We are emperor-fearing. We say the creed." The woman with the mirror coin eye did not nod. "We say it in the way glass says a face, with fidelity and correction." "Correction," Ven repeated, and heard the familiarity like gravity. "You mean heresy?" The priest spread empty hands. "Only if the emperor has no face to bear reflection." His next words were soft, not confident, but careful. "We do not claim knowledge. We claim method. We hold up what is given, and ask if there is more to see. If there is none, the glass remains plain. If there is more, the glass learns." The Magos' vox grill whispered, "Apotheosis by algebra." And Ven almost told him to be quiet, not because he was wrong, but because she was listening. They led the party beneath the tower. At the base, mirrors formed an ambulatory that suggested cloister walks from 1,000 shrine worlds, though here the arches were cut by geometry that made the stomach lurch if looked at too long. The plates were not fixed. They turned by degrees, aligning with one another until an image assembled like a sentence arriving word by heavy word. The sentence was the veritas obscura seen from without. Her prow scarred, her hull skin shifting faint as a sleeper adjusting blankets. Her observation deck crowded with faces that had no bodies any longer. The ship watched them from the mirror that was not a window, and Ven felt seen as by a thing she had once loved and now feared to touch. "Your vessel speaks our language," the priest said. "Word to flesh, flesh to word. It wrote you through the dark and brought you to the draft." "Draft," Ven said, and the echo of the scriptorium's final message pushed along her spine like a knife handle. "Begin new draft." The woman's mirrored eye caught their lamp beams and gave them back as constellations she didn't recognize. "You have been written," she said gently. "But you are not yet bound," the Magos asked. Because it was what a priest of Mars would ask when the heart frightened him too badly to be allowed speech. "By what mechanism?" "By wanting," the priest said, and Ven despised how her skin notched at the truth in it. "By curiosity, ungoverned by humility. We do not worship Tzeentch. We refuse worship, which is a kind of certainty. We practice listening. Listening remakes us. Remaking reveals. Revelation demands responsibility." He touched the sign of the Aquila and did not burst. "The Emperor receives prayers. The Astronomicon holds course. The Golden Throne's light does not instruct our faces to melt and learn. We do that by choosing to read too far into the margin." He had not said the god's name and yet had said it perfectly. Ven's mouth tasted of copper like promethium smoke. Behind her, one of her ratings lowered his weapon a centimeter, which by regulation was a mile. "What is this place?" she said. "What do you teach here?" The youth gestured like a student again, delighted and doomed. How to hold a mirror to a thought until it stops lying. They started the lesson with a small pane. It looked like something salvaged from a manufacturer's inspection bench. Square, palm-wide, unframed. The woman set it on a plinth cut from the cathedral's broken altar and breathed on it until fog filmed and cleared. "Stand," she told Ven, "and recall the moment you first believed you were captain." Ven almost refused. Command was obedience to duty within a skin of denial. You said yes to orders and no to self until the no felt like bone. But the pain caught her gaze and put it down as if laying a knife flat. She saw herself at 20, on a Scola balcony above a parade square. White gloves damp with nerves as bands built from brass and oxygen hammered a hymn into the sky. She saw the way the marshal's jaw shook when the wind cut, and how she decided then that fear must be invisible if it wished to live. The pain brightened. A second image walked out beside. The return to the Veritas Obscura felt less like ascent, and more like being read back into a story that had learned punctuation while they were away. The ship met them with silence too complete to be natural. The docking clamps sealed, pressure equalized, and still. No hum of servitors, no breath of engines, no echo of footsteps in the corridors that had once seemed infinite. The Vox confirmed environmental stability, but Ven knew that silence could lie. The choir of mirrors came aboard first. They did not walk so much as adjust themselves into the space, like reflections finding their surface. Their mirrored eyes caught every lumen, dividing light into languages the human retina couldn't decipher. When they spoke, it was without motion, lips still, sound arriving through the metal itself. Words resonating in bone. "The ink has found form," they said together. "It waits to be read." The Magos' instruments registered no transmission, yet his augmetic eye flickered with new data streams, fractals too dense to process. "The pattern isn't simply alive," he whispered. "It's communicating through topology, meaning expressed as architecture." Captain Ven led them through the wounded ship. The once sterile corridors now glistened with translucent residue, like glass sweating from the inside. The inscriptions that had once crawled across the walls were gone, burned away in the fires of containment. But their absence had weight. Negative reliefs pressed into the metal as if the ship remembered being written upon and missed it. They passed the scriptorium, or what remained. The air smelled of scorched parchment and something sweetly chemical, like ink distilled from blood. Beneath their boots lay the cracked shells of data slates, melted together into black strata. In the far corner, something pulsed faintly under a film of soot. When the Magos brushed it clean, the object breathed. It was a book. Bound in ship hide and stitched with copper wire, its pages were thin as membrane. They turned of their own accord, whispering. The ink shimmered, refusing to settle on any one form. A word might appear for an instant, only to dissolve into diagrams, then faces, then galaxies collapsing into syllables. One of the choir stepped forward, a girl with a voice that trembled like glass. She placed her hand upon the book, and the pages froze. "This is where it began," she said. "Every word ever spoken aboard. Every thought halfway formed before fear rewrote it." "The library remembers." Ven's jaw tightened. "You call this a library? It looks like a grave." The girl smiled faintly. "All libraries are graves. We bury our ignorance in pages, and hope knowledge will decay slower than flesh." The book quivered, reacting to the sound of her voice. The words rearranged into a sentence, scrawled in ink so dark it seemed to absorb the lumen beams. "The author is inside." The Magos knelt. "Captain." "I think it means Lorien." The choir bowed their heads. He became the first manuscript. They descended to the lower decks, following a pulse that grew louder the deeper they went. The walls were no longer metal. They had become translucent, fibrous, humming with a low vibration like the turning of pages underwater. Veins of glowing text ran through them, shifting constantly, spelling sentences that dissolved before comprehension. The choir moved unafraid. They whispered fragments of liturgy not found in any imperial canon, prayers of reflection, hymns of recursion. The air thickened with static. Every breath tasted of iron and ink. At the end of the main conduit lay a door that hadn't existed before. It was circular, alive and breathing. The surface flexed with slow rhythm, the seam pulsing like a throat. Ven raised her weapon. "What's behind it?" "The archive," said the priest of mirrors. "The heart of the pattern. It was born when the ink learned to remember sound." The door opened on its own. Inside stretched a cathedral made not of matter, but of narrative. Shelves rose into infinity, stacked with tomes that pulsed faintly as if containing captive heartbeats. Each book bore a name, some in high Gothic, some in glyphs that flickered between alphabets. Ven saw her own surname glowing faintly on one near the entrance. She didn't touch it. The air moved like thought. Pages turned themselves. Every word whispered as it rearranged, rewriting what it had just written. The library that devours, the choir intoned. It feeds on possibility. Every decision, every hesitation, every prayer. It records them all, then consumes the versions of you that never happened. The Magos' mechanical fingers twitched, almost reverently. Information entropy inverted. It's eating unrealities to maintain coherence. Ven stepped forward. The floor flexed beneath her boots, soft, almost warm. When she looked down, she realized it wasn't flooring at all. It was paper. Layers upon layers of it. Each sheet inscribed with her own log entries, her own words, rewritten in slightly different ways. She lifted one page. The ink crawled under her skin. Her own handwriting stared back, but the tone was wrong. Too calm, too knowing. It read, "I went willingly into the mirror, and the Emperor spoke my name backwards." She dropped the page. It melted back into the floor. The choir surrounded her. "You must read, Captain," the priest said. "Only the reader can know which version of the story survives." "I'm not part of this madness," she hissed. "You are the madness," he replied softly. "It was written in you before your birth. Every captain of every ship that crossed the eye carries a fragment of this library in her mind. The warp reads through you." The Magos reached for one of the glowing tomes. His augmentic hand trembled as he touched it. The book opened instantly, and a voice poured out, not through the air, but directly into thought. Magos Reth 97, born on Ryza. Initiatory scars hidden under metal. Prayed once to a god he called Logic. He died before he learned the name's true owner. Reth staggered back, tearing at the cables in his chest. "It's rewriting my memories, changing the order of what happened." "Not changing," the choir corrected. "Revealing." Ven fired a warning shot into the nearest shelf. The sound was devoured instantly, no echo, no heat. Only silence that spread outward, swallowing her voice when she tried to speak again. The books began to hum, low and resonant, like a choir tuning before a sermon. The noise built until it became a vibration that blurred the air. Pages peeled open on their own, and streams of black light poured out, coiling upward to form shifting shapes. Faces made of words, skeletons of phrases. Lorien's voice filled the chamber. "I wrote myself so I could stop existing. But the pattern only edits. It never deletes." The black light condensed into his shape, a man of ink and memory. His body translucent but trembling with residual humanity. His eyes were holes filled with mirrored dust. Ven raised her pistol, though she knew it was useless. "Lorien," he smiled faintly, voice layered with hundreds of tones. "Captain, you kept reading? What happened to you?" "I became margin note and author both. The ink needed direction, and I gave it mine." "But it doesn't end, Captain. Every word births another." He looked around at the towering shelves, his expression almost tender. "This is the Imperium's true scripture, the record of every lie told to preserve its truth." She shook her head. "You're not making sense." "Neither does faith," he said gently. "That's why it works." The books nearest her began to tremble. One fell open to a page depicting a city, Vespera 9, its mirrored tower rising in perfect detail. The image pulsed, alive. She could hear the choir chanting beyond the walls of the library, voices overlapping with her crew's, indistinguishable. "They're merging," Reth whispered. "Script and reader, they're converging into one data structure." Then turned to Lorien. "If this is your doing, end it. I can't." His form flickered. The author dies the moment the story learns to write itself. The chamber shook. Books tore themselves from the shelves and began orbiting the central space, spinning faster and faster until they became a vortex of pages and light. Words rained down like ash, burning into the air and forming sentences too vast to comprehend. Through the storm, Ven heard her own voice whispering, "The Emperor changes, as all must." She realized then, it wasn't Lorien's voice that had haunted the ship since the beginning. It was hers, written from another version of herself that had already made the wrong choice. The choir fell to their knees, chanting in a dozen languages. The shelves burned with silent flame, consuming not pages but possibilities. The library was feeding. "To understand," Lorien said, fading, "is to be rewritten." Then he was gone, absorbed into the black light that spiraled upward, vanishing into the infinite dark. Ven stood alone at the center, the book at her feet still whispering, the ink creeping slowly toward her boots like spilled thought reclaiming its owner. They found the passage behind the spiral by refusing to look away. The ridge Lorien had carved rose under the lumen like a scar healing in reverse. And when the choir asked the wall for honesty, the metal breathed. The seam split with the patience of something that had always been there, waiting for a name. Cool air flowed out that smelled faintly of ozone and old vellum. Captain Solara Ven led first because captains do. Because rank is a road you walk even when the ground changes under the boots that earned it. The Magos followed, muttering formulae that kept his hands steady. The choir came last, palms lifted as though balancing panes of invisible glass between thought and hunger. The corridor descended in a slow corkscrew, its curve gentle enough to feel benign until the eye realized the arc never repeated. Each step adjusted the radius by a hair, as if the ship measured their fear and tuned the geometry to it. Along the inner wall ran a thread, in truth only a hairline seam of radiance. But it moved like a living filament, slipping ahead of them, asking to be pursued. Ven did not touch it. The light had the color of the Astronomicon seen through a storm. Familiar, reduced, not to be trusted, and yet believed because ships otherwise forget how to arrive. At the spiral's nadir, the corridor opened onto a chamber that was not a room so much as a pause. The floor was a shallow dish of brushed metal, the walls unadorned, the ceiling a single circular aperture through which nothing could be seen. The thread ran to the center and vanished into the dish, which rippled at the contact as if remembering water. When the Magos stepped forward, the dish recognized weight and came alive. Lines unfolded. They rose from the floor in planes too thin to cast shadow, intersecting in nets that did not exist until you noticed them. Curves sprang from curves with the delicacy of veins opening under a winter wrist. The chamber filled with drawn light. Ven saw one line race outward and branch into 3, then into 9, then into more than counting. Each fork flickered with a brief image. A hand holstering a pistol. The same hand firing. The same hand unclenching from a rosarius, instead of clinging to it. The lines were not predictions. They were explanations. They were the ship's memory of how things might have happened, woven with how they almost did. The loom, the priest of mirrors whispered, as if giving a title to a pain so old it deserved a hymn. Where the pattern teaches consequence. The Magos' augmetic eye whirred helplessly, iris dilating to formal defeat. Not prophecy, he said, grateful for any certainty. State-space visualization. All outcomes consistent with present information, weighted by attention. Attention, Ven said. What you choose to look at becomes real faster, the woman with the coin eye answered, not unkind. What you refuse to look at asks someone else for a face. The floor wrote them a sentence. The lines condensed to form 3 figures standing together. Herself, the Magos, the priest. Rendered in tight filaments as faithful as any picked capture. Another triad sprang beside it, shifted half a step, arms in different places. Beyond that, a third, shoulders turned away. 100 Vens, each an edit, each wearing a decision like a different cut of cloth. She watched her face change rhythm by rhythm. A breath held, a jaw eased, an order swallowed before it became noise. The difference between mercy and annihilation could be less than the width of a blink. And yet every blink was a draft with its own empire behind it. The loom dimmed. A single thread brightened. A slim arc like a question mark en route to becoming a hook. It ran forward and upward and passed through her chest like a ray through clear water. Her body did not resist. Resistance, the loom explained without words, was another thread. She saw a ship that was her ship and not. A veritas obscura, whose hull had learned a friendlier grammar. Choir pilgrims in their salvage white moved through the corridors, teaching pains to men who wanted orders. She saw a bridge where prayers sounded like breath inside a helmet, quiet and clean, and the pattern slowed to a walk beside discipline without needing to be caged. In that thread she grew old, which seemed the kindest heresy of all. The loom brightened a second thread. It angled from the present like a blade. In it, she gave the order she had practiced in nightmares. Burn the archive, torch the choir, purge the ship so completely even the memory of comprehension could not survive. The line raced to a clean white end. No faces in windows, no ink in vents. A hulk adrift with nothing in it that could be taught how to want. The Astronomican's faint pressure on the soul the only voice left. The Emperor's silence, merciful. The Magos made a sound that was not laughter and not a sob. Both threads preserve the Immaterium, he said. One by integration, one by subtraction. Both are lies, the priest murmured, and Ven heard the kindness in it like salt in clear water. Integration is control disguised. Subtraction is fear in armor. Truth is not a single thread. Truth is the whole fabric, and we are not large enough to carry it without tearing. Lines lifted from the floor and twined around her hands without touching them. She could feel texture without contact, as if nerves had decided to guess. One thread pulsed when her heart did, and she realized with disloyal gratitude that some versions of her still believed they could ask the Emperor for a command and receive one in anything but light. Another shivered with a thought she had not let herself have since the Scola balcony. What if obedience had been the only heresy she was ever capable of? "Show me Lorien," she said. Not to be cruel, but because cruelty was a measure, and she needed a scale. The loom obeyed. It drew a man in filaments, then unspooled him into rings like a tree sawn and counted. In one ring he knelt and became a saint of mirrors, his body an instrument of calibration. In another he fled the ship in a lifeboat and wrote the pattern's grammar in the frost of a coffin orbit. In another he died quietly of exhaustion at his console, and the ink wrote itself without him, which seemed more honest than anything else. Ven reached to touch the version that had survived long enough to regret, but the thread behaved as all knowledge does when fingers assume they deserve proof. It moved. The loom showed Magos' wrath. In one thread he cut the cables from his chest and bled mortal, and went to ground on Vespera 9 as a penitent, teaching metal how to refuse certain shapes. In another he found a way to make glass immune to correction, and became a heretic to every world that needed correction to breathe. In most he simply watched, naming what he saw until the names ran out, which is how priests die when the gods do not need their bodies. "Why show us this?" Ven said. "Not angry now, only tired, which is a cleaner blade. What am I meant to choose?" "Not a line," the woman with the coin eye answered. "Attention. Hold 2 threads until your hands learn they were never separate." The loom darkened the futures and brightened the now. It wrote the present with disarming tenderness. A woman standing very straight in a circle of light, trying not to want anything more complicated than survival. The line through her chest strengthened, not to pull but to remind. She thought of the pain in the cathedral, the edits it had shown her without contempt. She thought of the library eating unrealities so the real could sleep without screaming. She thought of the crew whose faces had become drafts, and how some drafts had been more beautiful than the originals without being truer. "Captain," the Mago said softly, "there is a thread where we go back to the bridge and order nothing for as long as we can stand it. We maintain bearings. We breathe, we watch. We let the choir interpose glass between our reflex and our fear. We treat comprehension as a weapon with a safety catch. Abstinence," the priest said, almost approving. "A fast before a feast." Ven almost smiled because she almost hated him. "There is also a thread," she said, "where we stop pretending discipline is enough to make a god stand down." The loom agreed by drawing a third line, difficult to see unless you were willing to. It ran between the other two as a plumb line runs between hope and gravity. In it, she would open the archive again, deliberately this time, with pains ready, with prayers prepared to be corrected, but not surrendered. She would read the chapter where her ship learned to be more than a sentence and less than a god. And when the ink tried to write her name backward, she would answer forward and refuse to be offended when the letters looked prettier the other way. "Choose," the loom said without speaking. The word arrived as pressure behind the eyes, the weight of helmets, the feel of a bolt pistol not fired. She did not. Not yet. She remembered the choir's warning. The mirror never commands. It reveals the command you are already obeying. She looked for the thread that matched the order beneath her orders, the one she had carried since the fairy spine on Terra when the palace glowed like a coal breathing and a child had counted. The men it might save until numbers failed. She found it. It was thin and stubborn and lacked the drama of sacrifice. It ran through drills, after-action reports, small mercies not recorded, a refusal to humiliate subordinates when fear would have made it easy. It ran through a habit of standing the extra second at a viewport after a battle to watch debris stop being enemy and return to being matter. It was not a hero's line. It was the line of a steward. She closed her hand around air where the thread would be if the loom believed in hands. Something in the chamber accepted the gesture. The lines adjusted. The futures moved a hair. She had not chosen a destination. She had chosen a way of walking. The warp never knocks. It enters like a thought that seems your own. In the hours after they sealed the loom, the Veritas Obscura floated between nothing and the idea of direction. The choir slept in circles of mirror glass, breathing in cadence, as though synchronizing their dreams could hold the ship's skin together. The Magos dissected silence with the patience of an old machinist cleaning relic gears. Captain Ven sat before the bridge viewport watching Vespera 9 shrink into the distance, until its mirror tower became a spark pretending to be a star. She did not speak for a long time. Even the hum of the reactor waited for her to remember language. When she finally did, her words left frost on the glass. Set course for Terra. The Magos did not look up. The currents are wrong. We have not plotted a warp vector that returns to the same universe twice. Then plot the closest one that still believes in us. He began to answer, but the vox chimed once, soft, like a heartbeat heard through walls. It wasn't an alarm. It was acknowledgement. The choir woke together. Captain, they said, a single chord shaped by many throats. Someone has answered your reflection. The bridge lights dimmed to the color of dying parchment. On the forward glass, dust condensed into pattern, a spiral of equations that moved like breathing scripture. Ven's own reflection shimmered and split into two, one lagging half a breath behind. The delayed reflection smiled. Captain Ven, it said in her voice, layered with 1,000 tones too quiet to separate. You have learned the pain, the thread, the fast. You have earned an audience. Ven rose, hand on her pistol as if it mattered. Who am I speaking to? The reflection's eyes filled with the colors of burning libraries. To the will that makes questions possible. To the reason comprehension has teeth. To he who changes. The warped surface folded through the viewport. Light and dark changed places. The stars inverted like eyes rolling back in rapture. She woke standing, or thought she did. There was no deck beneath her, only surface tension strong enough to believe in. Around her, the void arranged itself into the shape of an impossible city. Towers of parchment and bone, streets paved with thought, statues built of sentences unspoken. The sky pulsed with hearts that might have been suns if they had not looked down. And at the center of that vast, whispering geometry stood a figure too tall to stand, too thin to be seen. Every time her eyes adjusted, the shape rewrote itself. A man of glass, a child made of color, a serpent uncoiling through hieroglyphs. Its voice arrived before the idea of a mouth could form. Solara Ven, said Tzeentch, the architect of fate. You have carried obedience farther than most carry rebellion. Her throat worked against air that felt alive. You called me. You called yourself. I merely answered the question hiding in your faith. She tried to kneel, but gravity forgot the meaning. I serve the Emperor. I believe service can save you. Yes. But tell me, Captain, who taught you that obedience and understanding cannot share a bed? The question crawled under her ribs. She wanted to quote Creed, to hide behind words blessed by repetition. But each syllable cracked like old wax. The architect stepped closer, or rather, the universe shortened to allow it nearer. You do not fear knowledge, he said. You fear owning the consequences of knowing. That is the Imperium's first law, ignorance as armor. I offer a different shield. Bargains from gods end in ruin. Ruins are where learning begins. The space around them unfolded into scenes from her memory, written in light. She saw the choir polishing mirrors on Vespera 9, Lorien dissolving into ink. Magos Reth bent over the loom like a penitent before an autopsy. Every image trembled between holiness and disease. They reached for comprehension, the god murmured. You reached for control, two faces of the same devotion. I ask only that you choose which one you will keep when I stop giving you excuses. Ven steadied herself. And if I refuse your terms, then the pattern continues without you. Your name will become a footnote in a sentence already correcting itself. Nothing is lost, nothing remembered. And if I accept, you will carry my grammar inside your command. You will steer ships through chaos without losing what they are. You will teach them to translate madness into motion. In return, I will borrow your eyes when I wish to see how mortals define faith today. The proposition was blasphemy balanced on a whisper. She felt its weight, small and enormous, like a coin that could buy a world or cut a throat depending on which side fell upward. Her first instinct was prayer. Her second was silence. The third was honesty. I don't want your power, she said, voice low. I want to understand how to survive you. For a moment, if time could still be measured, Tzeentch laughed, and the sound reassembled the world into new patterns. Then learn the oldest rule of architects. Nothing survives design. It only becomes purpose. The sky peeled open. Threads of the loom poured downward, binding themselves around her wrists like light willing to be chain. The god's voice softened. Take them. I am not master here. I am movement. Guide me through your kind's narrow corridors, and I will teach your people to build walls that breathe. You will call it salvation. I will call it curiosity. Ven closed her eyes. She saw Terra's towers, the glow of the palace, the countless prayers funneled into a man who had forgotten speech. She saw the choir of mirrors holding their pains between thought and hunger. She saw her ship, trembling, waiting to be told which direction was still real. And she understood the shape of her answer. She opened her eyes. I will take your threads, she said. but I will weave them in silence. You will not speak through me. The god's smile spread across reality like ink dropped in water. Then you will become the rarest of my servants, the one who edits the author. Go, Captain. Build your version of truth. When it fails, I will be waiting to correct you. The light folded inward. The city collapsed into language and returned to wherever grammar sleeps between dreams. She found herself again on the bridge of the Veritas Obscura. The viewport showed stars behaving like stars. The Magos knelt in a circle of burned glass, mumbling equations that bled. The choir were silent, hands clasped as though holding invisible weights. Ven looked down. Threads of faint blue light curled around her wrists, then sank beneath the skin. They pulsed once and vanished. Captain? The Magos whispered. What did it demand? She looked at him. At the mirrors. At the shadows listening through the hull. Her voice came steady, colder than prayer. It offered authorship, she said. I accepted editing rights. Outside, the void brightened, not with sun, but with thought. For the first time since the ship's birth, the warp currents bent around it instead of through it, giving the Veritas Obscura a corridor no map had ever known. The choir began to hum, low and reverent, a hymn without creed. Every mirror aboard caught the sound and returned it a little later, a little changed, until music filled the ship that no one could claim to have started. Ven sat in her command chair, gaze fixed on the dark horizon where reality folded into the promise of motion. Plot the course, she said. To where? Her reflection answered first, smiling a half-beat late. Forward, and the ship obeyed. The warp had color again. Not the roiling madness of crimson storms, or the cold indigo void of lost signals, but something living. Something that breathed. When the Veritas Obscura crossed into it, the stars did not vanish. They bent, curved into arcs of molten glass that flared and cooled in rhythmic waves, as if the universe itself were inhaling. From the bridge, it looked like beauty pretending to be mercy. Captain Solara Ven stood beneath the flickering glow of the observation deck, hands clasped behind her back. The skin of her wrists still faintly shimmered with the threads Tzeentch had given her, though the Magos insisted it was only an optical residue, a trick of her blood under different light. She didn't argue. There were more dangerous things than truth aboard this ship now. Every panel of the Veritas Obscura vibrated softly, humming like a choir too timid to sing. The warp's pressure no longer clawed against the hull. It guided. The ship rode invisible currents, its path uncharted but sure. The choir of mirrors moved through the decks like caretakers in a monastery, checking the reflective wards, whispering slow, recursive prayers that sounded more like mathematics than devotion. And in the silence between their chants, the ship listened back. It began as warmth, a faint, steady heat that emanated from the walls, like breath caught beneath steel. The crew ignored it at first. In the cold, damp echo of space, warmth was a kindness. But kindness never lasts long near the warp. Within hours, the warmth grew into fever. Control panels throbbed with faint pulses of light. Data slates left unattended began to smoke. The air smelled of ozone and old parchment. When the Magos touched one of the terminals, he yanked his augmetic hand back instantly. The surface had burned him, not with temperature, but with language. The contact left marks. Faint, branching letters written beneath the synth skin, glowing through the metal. The symbols didn't match any known code, yet every crew member recognized them instinctively. It's the pattern, whispered one of the choir. It's waking up. The lights dimmed. The ship's vox crackled, its static no longer random. The hum of the engines formed rhythm, and rhythm became verse. From somewhere deep within the reactor core came a voice that sounded like 1,000 pages burning at once. All things that seek knowledge must learn to feed upon it. Ven gripped the railing. Magos, cut the reactor link. He was already trying, but the machine spirit refused command. Its code bled into new structures faster than he could countermand them. The screens rippled with molten light, the same feverish gold-blue hue that glowed beneath Ven's skin. It's self-optimizing, he gasped. It's rewriting the ship's energy lattice into language. Captain, it's turning the reactor into scripture. And as the words left him, the walls ignited. Fire rolled through the decks, not as flame, but as light so dense it seared thought before flesh. The corridors pulsed with molten script, letters bursting into sparks that fell like ash. The air carried no heat, yet every breath tasted of burning. The Veritas Obscura was writing itself from the inside out. Ven staggered against the railing. Through the viewport, she saw the warp ripple outward from the ship, a shockwave of radiance twisting the void into spirals. The choir dropped to their knees, voices breaking into hymns that melted into static. This is ascension, one cried. No, Ven hissed. This is combustion. The Magos collapsed against the console, his augmetics sparking. Lines of fire crawled under his skin like veins. He looked up, eyes wide and lucid despite the agony. It's feeding on the futures we rejected. Every thread the loom showed us. It's burning the choices to power itself. Ven drew her pistol, though she didn't know why. Can it be stopped? He smiled faintly, a human gesture borrowed from memory. Not stopped, directed. The pattern's learning, like all gods do. She ran to the core. The corridor bent around her, walls glowing with living script. Faces flickered in the light. Lorien, the choir, her younger self, each whispering versions of the same plea. Finish the story. The floor rippled beneath her boots like skin. The closer she came to the reactor, the louder the humming grew until it became symphonic, a roaring chorus of thought-given flame. When she entered the chamber, she almost fell to her knees. The heart of the ship was gone. In its place burned a sun. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a man, but it spun with the gravity of memory. Words orbited it, sentences written in fire, turning and colliding to form new meanings. Every orbit left trails of molten gold that twisted into geometric halos. The light filled the chamber like a living scripture. She could hear the voice again, no longer from the Vox, but from within her skull. Captain Solara Ven, you have read the loom. You have refused the silence. You have carried the threads. Now finish the pattern, Tzeentch, she breathed. You said you'd wait. I never wait, the voice answered. I only arrive when comprehension ripens. This is not judgment. This is evolution. The light pulsed. Images unfolded in the fire. The ship adrift in the void. The choir turned to statues of molten glass. The Magos' metal bones glowing like lanterns. Ven saw her own body standing at the edge of the sun, her skin burning away until only the luminous threads remained, weaving into the core. This is how knowledge sustains itself, said the voice. Through translation. Through sacrifice. She took a step forward, heatless flames licking at her boots. And if I refuse, then you will become a story that ends, and stories that end are eaten by the ones that don't. The words struck deeper than threat. They sounded like prophecy, or worse, bureaucracy. She raised her pistol, but the metal began to glow, the barrel reshaping into script mid-air. The weapon melted into her palm like liquid steel, leaving a symbol carved into her flesh. The same spiral Lorien had drawn. She fell to her knees. Emperor, guide me. For a moment there was silence, and then, impossibly, something answered. Not Tzeentch, not the warp, but a voice so quiet it felt human. You already know how, she looked up. The sun writhed, collapsing inward. The flames twisted into the shape of a great eye. Neither divine nor human, but familiar. It mirrored her own. Realization hit her like gravity. The pattern wasn't consuming knowledge. It was mirroring it. It burned to preserve, not destroy, to record the act of survival as testimony. She rose slowly, arms trembling, and stepped into the light. The fire didn't consume her. It translated her. Every thought, every fear, every choice became word and word became motion. Her voice joined the choir of flames, a whisper in the inferno. To burn is to remember. The light expanded, filling the core, then the corridors, then the entire ship. For a heartbeat, the Veritas Obscura blazed brighter than any star. And then, silence. When the glow faded, the ship drifted quietly through the void. The warp around it had calmed, folding back into stillness. The metal was cool again. The choir stirred one by one, their mirrored eyes dim but alive. The Magos opened his remaining organic eye and looked to the bridge console. Every screen displayed a single line, written in golden script. The captain is writing. No one spoke. Somewhere deep in the vessel, a heartbeat continued. Not mechanical, not divine, but human, and in the dark heart of the reactor. The sun pulsed once more. Softly, rhythmically. Like breath, the pattern was still burning, but now it burned with her. Dawn is a superstition in space, but the Veritas Obscura found a way to have one. After the burning, the ship emerged into a thin wash of ordinary starlight that felt like morning after months of fever. The warp peeled off our hull in sheets, slow and reluctant, each layer carrying a taste of ash and old pages. The choir woke as if surfacing from deep water. Their mirrored eyes had lost the fever glow, leaving only pale reflections that arrived on time again. The Magos stood hunched at the master console, augmetic digits trembling from currents that had written scripture through metal. His remaining organic eye looked older, not weary, historic. We were moving on a vector the charts named, but no log had traveled in living memory. Out ahead, very small and very stubborn. The beacon of the Astronomicon pressed at the mind like a fingertip through cloth. It was not a voice. It was a direction that pretended not to care whether you could bear it. I let it fill the soft tissue behind my eyes until the ache steadied my hands. The reactor's new heartbeat kept time with my own. "Confirm position," I said. The Mago's Vox grill rasped and found breath. "We are within sanctioned lanes for segmentum solar, Captain. Drift minimal. Translation residue? Contained." He paused, then added in the tone of a priest confessing to his god instead of to a docket, "I do not know what contained means anymore." "Contained means it obeys the size of our ship," I said, "until I say otherwise." The choir formed a circle at the rear of the bridge. They did not sing. They breathed in fours, palms lifted as if feeling for pains that were there by decision alone. Light from the observation glass washed over their faces and came back empty of tricks. It felt like honesty, shipwide, I said. "All hands, bear witness. We are through. We are not finished. Stand your watches. Speak what you can carry. If your thoughts grow teeth, place a pane between mouth and hunger and breathe until the teeth forget they were invited." I clicked off, then stood very still until the deck remembered I was heavier than dread. The Astronomicon brightened, not in the eyes, but in the bones. A pressure that had the shape of home if you were willing to be generous. "Request astropathic channel," I said. There was no astropath left aboard, not in the way administratum forms recognize. The men and women sanctioned for that work had passed into glass or outline when the ink learned how to wear voices. But the choir had its own ritual. They unrolled a veil of thin mirror plates across the deck in a spiral and sat at its edges with their backs to one another, so no one could see a face and mistake it for proof. The priest placed a simple vox amp in the center as if it were a relic. When they began, the sound was only breath made into architecture. "We will not call," he said. "We will reflect. If Terra wishes to know us, it will speak into the pain." He glanced to me for permission the way men look to doors before opening them. I nodded. They exhaled together. The plates took the breath and gave it back. The second echo came a heartbeat late. The third carried weight that did not belong to lungs. Something had answered. Not the warp's slick laughter. Not the pattern's hunger. A pressure that tasted of incense ground too fine. Of oil that has forgotten it was ever light. I have stood in cathedra and manufactoria, in locked chapels with lance officers after victories. We did not have the language to name properly. I have heard great men speak until silence saved the room from meaning. This was none of that. This was a room kept empty on purpose. We waited in it. The priest of mirrors bowed his head, not kneeling, not daring presumption with knees. "Most divine," he said quietly, and the honorific did not crack. "We return damaged and, we hope, useful." The vox amp clicked once. Ozone, old dust, then nothing. The Mago's claws stopped moving. "There is latency," he whispered. "No content, only the deliberate maintenance of space. Is that refusal?" One of the ratings asked before discipline could save him from the question. "It is permission," I said. The words surprised me by being true when I heard them. "We are not told which face to wear. We are told to choose one and take responsibility for it." A long breath. Then the choir drew in air as one, released as two. Their circle broke into twos and threes. Certain panes lifted and turned to face the forward glass. In each plate, the Astronomicon appeared as the same bruise-colored star, but each reflection lagged by a different fraction. Not random. A message measured in timing, not speech. The Magos muttered numbers until a pattern consented to be named. "Intervals of 2' rhythm," he said. "A code of restraint, a rubric for not knowing too much at once." The Emperor had not spoken. He had held still with us long enough that our hunger forgot to shout. "Captain," the watch officer said softly, "there is another contact." Void signatures scrolled in the corner of my vision like a prayer list handed to a woman with one candle. Warships translate from myth into steel all the time near the throne, but the silhouette that resolved ahead of us was old and honest. An inquisitorial cruiser traveling without its teeth bared. No gun decks hot, no bombardment lance open to the weather. A ship of judgment coming with its weapons polite. "Magos," I said. "Identity codes align with the Ordo Hereticus," he answered. "Secondary sigil suggests an attached Ordo Malleus confessor. They are broadcasting a request for parley, humanitarian and doctrinal." "Humanitarian," I said, and let the word sit in my mouth until it lost its coat of suspicion. "Bring them alongside on my mark." Choir. Pains to every corridor. Reflective discipline enforced. We will be read and we will refuse to perform. The docking ballet was uneventful in the way men describe miracles they do not want to owe anyone. Pressure equalization arrived like a verdict that forgot how to threaten. 2 boarding bridges extended. No thunder of boots. 4 figures crossed, robes dark, carapace gleaming in the tempered light. The rosette at the lead's throat was not raised like a weapon. It hung like a document carried by a clerk who has seen more deaths than reports. We met them in a clean corridor. The walls were dull, no reflections except those the choir allowed in panes held at carefully imprecise angles. The priest kept his hands visible. The magos dimmed his augmetic eyes out of courtesy to lenses. I did nothing about my wrists. The threads had sunk deep enough that only I could feel them. Captain Solera Ven, the Inquisitor said, voice dry with the humility of someone declaiming from memory. By warrant and writ, I am empowered to assess contamination, preserve imperial citizens from damnation, and prevent novel heresies from discovering how to name themselves. I am also empowered to listen. God Emperor bless him for the order of those clauses. I gave my name and ship with the respect the office deserved, then did the unthinkable thing in the old playbook and told the truth first. We translated badly and survived in a shape we did not set out to wear, I said. We invited the mirror between thought and hunger, and we broke our reflex for answers. We burned without fire and fed a reactor with futures we declined to own. We were offered authorship. I accepted editing. We stand now in Segmentum Solar with discipline intact and doctrine under observation. If you choose to end us, end only our hull. A great many of my people are still learning to hold their faces. He did not flinch. He did not raise a purity seal between us like a shield. He looked down the corridor past me and watched 2 ratings check a pane for lag, correct the angle, nod to one another with the relief of men who have found work that feels like prayer. When he met my eyes again, a fraction of the steel in his office had become mercy. You claim the mirror as intercessor, he said. Not as idol, as boundary, I answered. We let it keep us from thinking faster than we can repent. The confessor at his shoulder, Malleus by the sober geometry of his sigils, studied the plating near my wrists with a craftsman's sadness. And the changer? Offered grammar, I said. I refused voice. The magos made the smallest noise of warning. I did not correct myself. If confession is to mean anything in the Immaterium, it must occasionally be dangerous. We walked them to the archive door. It had closed after the burning, not sealed, simply remembered the size of a room, and obeyed it. Where a breathing seam had once pulsed like a throat, there was brushed metal, and the idea of a page turned and placed between book covers. I put my palm to it. Warmth came back, not heat, not hunger. A permission to read if I dared speak the title aloud. Before you open heresy to inspection, the Inquisitor said low, tell me what you expect to find. Not power, I said. A record of the promises we are willing to make to our own attention. The library devoured unrealities to keep the real from panicking. If we open it, we acknowledge the cost of choosing. If we keep it closed, we lie. And the lie will instruct the next anomaly. He considered the shape of that, head tilted the way men listen to engine tone when a bearing starts to sing. The confessor's gaze stayed at my wrists. The choir stood with their panes like monks with lamps. The magos, to his credit, kept his hands behind him to stop them from reaching. Curiosity is a holy sin for his kind, and he had been forgiven enough for one voyage. Very well, the Inquisitor said at last. Open a little, enough to be judged safely. I will pray for the amount to be sufficient. We did not pray aloud. We let the silence bear the weight. The seam remembered how to breathe. The door sighed inward, the width of a hand. No brilliance, no ink tide. Just the smell of iron and paper and the machine smoke of hot logic cooled to something gentler than... No one knows what day it was when the Veritas Obscura finally slept. Time had loosened its hold on the ship long ago, reduced now to the rhythm of breath and reactor pulse. The void outside was not dark. It shimmered faintly, like something vast beneath glass waiting for permission to wake. Inside, the corridors had stopped whispering. The ink had cooled to the color of iron. The mirrors reflected accurately again, but each reflection seemed to hesitate. Just enough to remind the crew that the memory of corruption never truly leaves. You could stand in front of your own face and feel it thinking about you. Captain Solara Ven walked the length of the bridge one last time, her hand brushing the cold rail as if tracing a sentence she hadn't finished writing. The magos slept. In a chair near the reactor console, cables coiled like rosaries. The choir of mirrors sat in quiet meditation, each with a single glass pane laid across their knees, unlit. The hum of the engine carried a low, constant chord, the ship's final prayer. Ven stopped before the viewport. The Astronomicon burned, faintly on the horizon, distant, unwavering, a wound that refused to scar. Terra was still out there, spinning its legends, feeding its light into an empire that had forgotten how to rest. But between that light and this silence lay something new, something that didn't belong to either god or demon. For the first time in months, she spoke without issuing an order. "Magos," she said softly, "if we died today, would it matter?" He opened his remaining eye, the human one. "To what metric, Captain?" "To the pattern." He thought, then smiled, a small, crooked expression more mortal than any sermon. "To the pattern, everything matters. That's the curse and the comfort. It learns from every version of us, even the ones that never existed." She looked out again. "And to the Emperor?" The Magos folded his hands. "To him, Captain. Perhaps the same." That night, or what passed for it, the ship began to dream. The choir woke first, their breathing aligned, mirrors pulsing faintly with inner light. Through the hull came a vibration, low and steady, like the turning of immense pages. The Magos rushed to the console, his voice tight with awe. "Captain," he whispered, "the reactor's emitting chronometric patterns. It's writing time." The words made no sense, and yet they did. On every deck, light bled through seams, and inscriptions bloomed across the walls. Not the feverish, chaotic scrawl of old corruption, but measured, deliberate lines written in their own ship's handwriting. Reports, observations, fragments of thought. The logs of a vessel learning to narrate itself. Rotation 1. The pattern holds steady. Dreams of Terra observed. Rotation 2. The captain stands at the glass again. Her reflection forgives her. Rotation 3. Knowledge stabilized through silence. The Veritas Obscura was documenting her own piece. The Magos stared at the streams of text filling the displays. "Captain, it's recursive. Each log is aware of the previous one. It's writing causality backwards, looping reality around itself." Ven stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. The words on the console rearranged as she spoke. "Captain Solara Ven. Present tense confirmed." She felt something shift in her chest, the threads under her skin humming faintly in rhythm with the reactor. "What's it doing?" The Magos' tone softened, reverent. "It's completing the design. The pattern's burning stopped when it realized you were part of the equation. Now it's closing the loop. It's turning itself into a story that ends the way it began." Ven closed her eyes. "A story that remembers." They descended to the archive together, the Inquisitor and his retinue still aboard. Watching from a distance they dared not cross. The air inside the archive was calm, almost fragrant, like paper left in sunlight. Every shelf glowed faintly from within. The Magos ran his hand along one spine. The book trembled open. Inside the pages were blank, until he whispered. Then words bled across the parchment, tracing the shape of his voice. He stepped back. "It's waiting for you, Captain." Ven took the book in her hands. The cover was warm, the letters on its spine rearranged, resolving into words she knew would be carved into memory long after her body turned to dust. "The fate that changes itself." She opened it. The pages flickered with scenes, Lorien listening to static in the dark, the ink learning to think, the mirrors teaching reflection, her own hands reaching toward fire. And there, between one heartbeat and the next, she saw what she had never allowed herself to see, an ending where the ship came home. In that version, the Veritas Obscura descended through Terra's clouded skies. Its hull burned with harmless light, and from the wreckage stepped not saints, not heroes, but men and women who had learned to hold both faith and curiosity without letting either devour them. They didn't kneel. They stood. The book closed itself. The warmth receded. "Captain," said the Mago softly, "the archive wants to know if this is the ending you'll accept." Ven traced the cover with her thumb. "There are no clean endings, Magos, only quieter beginnings." They returned to the bridge. The stars outside had shifted, not moved, shifted, as though reality itself had turned the page. The Astronomicon was gone from sight, replaced by a diffuse golden haze that felt like the ghost of dawn. No coordinates matched, no records recognized the sector. The universe had folded around them and forgotten the shape they'd once occupied. The Magos checked his readings twice, then stopped pretending they made sense. Captain, we're nowhere. Ven smiled faintly. Then maybe nowhere's what we were supposed to find. The choir began to hum again, but softer now, more human. Their panes reflected not infinite faces, but one steady image. The captain standing still, eyes closed, breathing in time with the ship. Captain, whispered the priest of mirrors. What shall we do now? She opened her eyes. The light caught the threads beneath her skin, shimmering faintly like constellations rearranging themselves. We hold course, she said, until someone else finds us, or until the story forgets to stop. Far away, in the vast silence of the void, a beacon flared to life. No imperial transponder, no demonic cipher, just a pulse of light shaped like a spiral. It repeated, every 90 heartbeats, a signal made not to summon rescue, but to tell anyone listening that something, somewhere, had learned to survive understanding. Back on Terra, centuries later, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica would record faint transmissions echoing through the Astronomican's shadow. Phrases spoken in a dozen voices overlapping perfectly. We were not answered. We were allowed. To burn is to remember. The pattern holds. And sometimes, when the static grew low enough to be mistaken for silence, one could almost hear the last voice of Captain Solara Ven, carried across eternity like the memory of a ship that refused to vanish. Change is not the enemy. Forgetting is. Then the signal would fade, and the stars would resume their ancient conversation. Patient. Endless. Unbothered by gods or empires. The Veritas Obscura sailed on through the hush between realities, its hull still warm from the last fire it had ever needed, its name forever rewritten across the warp like a question that learned how to answer itself. End of the When Reality Melts Chronicle.